Good afternoon, all. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Manu for inviting me to have a session here. And today's topic is entitled Language Women Articulating the Margin. So the title, I have slightly changed the title, and the title is Language Women Articulating the Margin. So language, everybody knows that language is a system of communication, and it plays an important role in forming the social and cultural identity of our lives. So in many cultures, we can see that who originated the language, who created the language. So if we take the Genesis, the book of Genesis, we can see that it was God, his speech is seen as a gift of divine, or it is of a divine being to humankind. In the book of Genesis, we can see that Adam is given the power to name the acts of creation. Similarly, in ancient Egyptian culture, we can see that the male god, that is Thoth, he's called Thoth, and he is given the power to name the acts of creation. And if you take the Icelandic tradition, you can see that the god called Odin, he is the creator of language. But in many other cultures, like ancient Chinese culture, in earliest cuneiform scripts, you can see that the goddesses were the creators of language. Likewise, in ancient Sumerian culture, we can see that the goddess called Nidaba. Nidaba, she is the goddess of words. In ancient Indian culture, we can see that goddess Saraswati is the creator of words. She is the creator of literature. And like in Celtic culture, we can see that the goddess called Bridget, she was the creator of words. So what I want to say is that you can see a connection between the language and women. You can establish a connection between the language and women in many cultural aspects. So we are talking about the connection between language, religion, and different cultures. So we will move on to the ancient or the classical traditions of Greece and Roman. We can see that in classical antiquity, the girls took only primary education in ancient Greece. The girls were only taught how to read. Like that, they were only given such very elementary training actually. The girls were not given any secondary education. So they were sent to schools, almost all in the cases, the girls who belonged to the elite families, they were sent to private tuition centers. And women scholars or women philosophers like Aspasia, Aspasia and Hypatia, these scholars actually, they were given private tuition, and they were known as the women scholars from the Greco-Roman tradition. And like the people like in Greece, you know that in ancient Greece, you know that it was an island, a group of islands. Lot of islands were there, and one particular island you might have heard of, Sparta. Sparta, the island, the ancient island Sparta, and the Spartan women of Sparta. They were very courageous. They were warrior women actually, and there was an archetype. There was a woman warrior leader from Sparta called Godo. And you can see that in Plutarch, he in his writings, you can see that the Athenian women, they asked the Spartan women, they asked, why do you overrule your husbands? Why do you overrule your men? Then she said, because we were the mothers of these men. So we can see some two kinds of traces in ancient Greece. That is what I just want to say. But generally speaking, women were not given education, in the sense they were not given, they were given only elementary education, they were not given any secondary education. They were trained in philosophy, they were trained in philology, but they were not trained in grammar and rhetoric. You can't see a teacher, a single teacher from the Greek tradition, you can't see a teacher of grammar from Greco tradition, because at that time women were not supposed to speak in public spaces. So this Pericles is an ancient author from Greek tradition, and he said the greatest glory of woman is to be least talked about among men, whether in praise or blame. So you can see such tradition in our great adages like the proverbs like silence is gold, speech is silver and silence is gold. And a Dutch proverb goes like this: a woman rarely wears her prestigious ornament, that is silence. So these all proverbs actually, they lead to the conclusion that women are not supposed to talk publicly. And in ancient Greece, also you can see that the great woman scholar Hypatia, she was killed. Why? She was killed why? Have you read the novel called Francis Etikora by T.D. Ramakrishnan? You can see a chapter in which Hypatia was, you can see the history of Hypatia in that book actually. So why she was killed? Because she was a learned woman and she talked in the public spaces against the government, against the patriarchal system of that civilization actually. So women were silenced. Women were totally invisible from the history of Western civilization. This is what, if you go to the history of world history, you can see that at several stages, women were silenced. Women were invisible in the history of Western civilization. So we can see that in pre-Platonic age or pre-Socrates ages, women were given liberty to talk. Women were given to talk. But after Plato, during the age of Aristotle, the great philosopher, he thought that women were weaker than men, not only physically but intellectually. And Stoics, you know that the group of Greek scholars actually. So Stoics and Platonics, they argued that women's souls are not as such inferior to men's souls. Women's souls are not as such inferior to men's souls. This is what the Stoics, they believe like that. But Aristotelian school, they believe that women were inferior to men and they were not supposed to talk in public spaces. Okay. So the Judaic and Christian tradition actually, they reiterated this Aristotelian concept that in public domain, that was not given to her. That is not supposed to be the place of women. It should be the place of men. And since the Christianity, normally the doctrines of Christianity believe that both men and women, they commonly, they share common human nature, but women were, the public domain was not the place of women. Later, in different centuries, after different centuries, during 19th century, again the subject of language got more and more, many philologists actually, they studied the origin and the growth of language and the scattering of tongues and the destruction of a linguistic unity in the biblical narrative of the Tower of Babel is seen as one of the curses of human race. Related to the biblical story, into the 19th century, it inspired the myth of the original and pure Usprachi being pursued in linguistic history. Usprachi means there was a belief that there was a prototype language for all European, Indo-European languages.
What is that name?
Usprachi. It's a German name actually. Usprachi. It's a product. It's a symbol. It's an imaginary concept actually. Okay. Then it eventually led to structuralism, and you can see formalism, and finally it culminated into the post-structural thoughts on language. So I just want to tell you, we have Edward Sapir was there. Sapir's hypothesis of language was here, and it was questioned by the cognitors like Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky believed that there is a universal grammar. This is the corpus system which connects each and every language in the world itself. And this hypothesis made by Edward Sapir and Wolff was questioned by Chomsky and his disciples. And later, the second wave feminism also questioned, or they raised the question of language again. In 1973, the US linguist called Robert Lakoff, he published Language and Woman's Place, a study which has become widely recognized for its assertions about linguistic gender differences and their significance to gender inequality. So Lakoff, this is a seminal study in this field, and he claimed that women employ a distinct style of speech, women's language, which comprises linguistic features that demonstrate and reinforce women's inferior position in society. So Robert Lakoff mainly he focused on how women use language in public domain and how the construction of woman is exercised through language. So these are the basically two items that Lakoff focused on. And later you can see that language became a question by the French feminists. I told the French feminists actually they asked how they asked or they questioned the psychoanalytic theories put forward by Freud and neo-Freudian like Lacan. And the French feminists they asked the psychoanalytical theories behind the creation, behind the origin of language, and how language is perceived by the psycholingual approach. And meanwhile, you can see that I told you language was questionable. I mean, this is this assumption. The language can be a site of lots of debates have come up from different corners actually. And in this time, after 1973, the study by Robert Lakoff, you can see that a very famous Australian linguist and a feminist called Dale Spender, she published Man-Made Languages. Man-Made Languages, this was very seminal work by this Dale Spender actually. And Dale Spender mainly, she mainly focused on the gendered sense of language actually. The gendered sense of language. And she focused mainly on these concepts. The expression of language by women. How can women construct reality through language? We generally believe that our experiences actually make reality, but our language is insufficient to articulate the experience of woman, and we women speak in the language of male. This is what the assumption, this is what the the thought that Dale Spender had, she wanted to propagate. So she, am I audible to you? Okay. Okay. Yes. So she just want to criticize us as the maleness of language. The female experiences are not portrayed or are, no word we can see. She took lot of examples from the sexuality of human being, human race itself. The term itself, foreplay, the term itself, it is not a term of women's, it doesn't, this term particularly doesn't represent the experience of a woman, but it is the experience of a man that carries. Several examples, she has given several examples actually. Likewise, another US linguist called Carolyn Merchant, she is a cultural historian. She wrote a book called The Depth of Nature, and she said she constructs rejected the epistemological paradigm based in Cartesian hubris. So we know that the Descartes, the René Descartes, he made the division between the mind and the body. So that is called Cartesian hubris. And you can see that here the domination of men over by women can be seen in Cartesian hubris. And she rejected this kind of Cartesian hubris. And she herself deconstructs the history of science itself. How we, if you trace the invisibility of women in science, we have already seen the invisibility of women in the history of Western philosophy. How women were silenced in classical Greco-Roman traditions. And here they wanted to, these women cultural historians and linguists, they wanted to deconstruct the history of science itself. This history of science itself is very much male dominated actually. And they wanted to, what I want to say is they wanted to deconstruct the writings by Francis Bacon, Francis Bacon, the father of the father of experimental science actually. And Caroline Merchant actually, she deconstructed the history of science through Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess. Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess. And according to Caroline Merchant, George Sarton was the founding father of the history of science, and how he used Isis to represent nature. The goal of positivist science thinkers, science thinkers means science is based upon the observation. Through observation and experiments, you come to a you come to a conclusion. That is the basic stone of positivist ideology. Actually, it was first initiated by Francis Bacon. And the positivist science was to solve nature's mysteries by disclosing the secrets that she harbored within. So science makes people believe that it knows nature by representing nature through written texts, symbols, and metaphors. So first, Francis Bacon represented the mechanical view and developed the concept of art of mastery and obedience of nature at the onset of industrialization. So even though he inherits from Platonic worldview, but he incorporates the aggression which Plato had excluded. So even though he was from he was a Platonian, he elucidated many of his ideas from Plato, but he used a kind of aggressive method to conquer nature and to conquer language. This is what the assumption, this is what the theory propounded by Caroline Merchant. And we see how it happened, it happened in Bacon's lectures, Bacon's writings. Francis Bacon actually appealed to rape metaphors. In language, he used rape metaphors to persuade his audience that he was a proponent of experimental method, and he wanted to say his audience that experimental method is a good thing. In order to establish experimental method, he used rape metaphors in his very famous book called De Augmentis. De Augmentis is a very seminal work by Francis Bacon, and he said that this rape metaphors, like if you, how can you how do you create reality? You can just experiment and just observe it, and you can come to a conclusion. So by how to use nature, you can use a woman. Likewise, you can use you can use nature like that, and it eventually led to the creation of experimental method in which Francis Bacon was well versed in. So Caroline Merchant actually, she used the Baconian, the Baconian language, and Baconian language is very much assertive and it's very much male dominated. And the entire male domination actually it began from Francis Bacon. His language itself is male dominated, and the history of science is male dominated one. And the Francis Bacon and his experimental method was instrumental for that. This is what Caroline Merchant, the cultural historian, said actually. And you can also see Sandra Harding. She was also an anthropologist and a linguist, and she said how Bacon used sexual imageries in his experimental method in her very famous essay, Whose Science and Whose Knowledge? And in the same essay, she also used the same very misogynistic sexual imageries. So Bacon was behind, we know that Bacon was behind establishing the, this is called rational thinking over sentimentality. So Bacon, he followed the Cartesian hubris and he established this notion of rationality is at the best, and he established this by using his experimental method. This is what our assumption. And let's see how the 18th century writers actually, writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and Radcliffe and Jane Austen, these kind of writers, how they established or how they incorporated this notion in their writings. Whether they faced any kind of dilemma or whether they tried to incorporate all these notions of the Descartesian notion of Descartesian hubris in the writings, or whether they have any, they face any such kind of personal dilemmas while incorporating both ration and sentiments. This is what we just want to analyze actually. So we can say that women writers from 18th century England, they began to respond to the idea of sensibility by focusing on its implication for gender. So I just want to take, you can see that many writers were there, many male writers were there, and you can see a very few names like Mary Wollstonecraft and Radcliffe, and to an extent Jane Austen was there. And if I take Mary Wollstonecraft, she is considered to be the mother of almost all feminists actually. And Mary Wollstonecraft, how she responded to the idea of, the Baconian idea of rationality. So you can see in her Vindication, she wanted to recover the female body from the repercussions of the culture of sensibility and re-establish the woman's identity during this period. So well-known critic Jane Todd posits that Wollstonecraft wanted to advocate for an androgynous mix of sentiment and reason involving both male reason and female sensibility. So she just wanted to clubbing up a kind of male rationality and a kind of female sensibility. So we know that her Vindication, how many of you, is there a text prescribed to this university? Vindication? Yes, okay. You know that it's a reflection, it's a reactionary text on Edmund Burke actually. So Edmund Burke's text. So you can see that she just wanted to establish what kind of a gender we just want to create in that 18th century England. This is what she just wanted to re-establish. So in her Vindication, she ridiculed at the schools of French schools actually. So why did she ridicule at the French School of Education? Why? Not teachers, this is a question for students. So why? Why? Because French School of Education is sentimental education. This school of education actually teaches you how to please people, how to please men actually. So women, you are supposed to be at the home and this is your world and you just want to please your family members of the family, especially men, the elder men, and children, how to nurse your children, how to take care of your family, like that. Okay, so she just ridiculed at the effeminacy of French education, and she vehemently opposed Edmund Burke's for his defense of effeminacy of British culture. Actually, so French were actually during those times, you know that the French Revolution was on the onset, and French people were very revolutionary people. And but the school of French education that she couldn't she couldn't digest the main components of French school and French school of education. But Edmund Burke, the political thinker, one of the greatest political thinkers of that period, she vehemently opposed his political ideologies, and she just wanted to address that this should be, the woman should be like this. The 18th century woman should be like this. She just wanted to, she should be a mix of male rationality and a female sensibility. And the same Wollstonecraft, you can see that if you go to the letters by Mary Wollstonecraft, you can see a kind of slight changes from her vindication, because I told you she is in a fluid state. She couldn't establish that a female should be, a lady should be in the category, she should be in the state of fusing together the male rationality and the female sensibility. Instead of that, while in her letters, if you go through her letters, you can see that she is a passionate mother, she is a woman entrepreneur, and she is a solo traveler. And when after her suicide attempt, she decided to take a business trip to Norway, and where she wrote a report on that. In her diaries, she wrote like that, how the people, how the Norwegian people came here, and it was totally a strange experience for these Norwegian people to see a European lady to roam around in this Scandinavian country, because Norway is a part of Scandinavian country, no? So she is from this place, the other part of Europe, and she traveled from this part of Europe to the Scandinavian part of Europe. And how the people, the people made we have a lot of men travelers are there, but we don't have female travelers like Mary Wollstonecraft. And Mary Wollstonecraft, in many of her books, in her letters, she uses the language that focuses on her physical appearance and the locals' concern for her safety. How a solo traveler like Mary Wollstonecraft, who will ensure her safety, the people's concern over her safety. Likewise, when she wrote about her personal experiences, you can see that she used a kind of a very poetic language. She used a kind of more, a kind of a very poetic and a female sensibility in that writings. How she used these kind of languages, how she established the kind of languages that she wanted to establish it. But even though in her indication it's a political text, but in her personal realm, she used a very feminine poetic language. And then again, if I want to tell you how the romantics, you know that mainly the male poets, how they use language actually. You can see Wordsworth, you can see S.T. Coleridge, you can see John Keats and many other romantic poets. They used a kind of very poetic language, a very, you can see a lot of sentimental language they used, and how this trend was questioned by the later 19th century critics. So here what I just want to say we have already told the myth of Usprachi was in the debate. It came it came up as whether we have a common ancestral language for all the Indo-European languages. These kind of questions was there from almost all the corners of the world. And during those times, you know that the thinkers like Freud and Freud's notion of language and Freud's notion of human sexual development model, and this was during the 20th century, the first half of 20th century, these ideas got more currency actually. The growth of man in the sense, they only talked about the male, the human being in the sense, human being is as it is synonymous with male actually. So during that time, you can see that Lacan's model of language, he told language is structured, unconscious, language is structured like unconscious. And his idea was questioned by the French feminists and French linguists actually. There were Luz Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, and Helen Sissu. And ultimately, they were all feminists, but they all worked on the area of language. So they just want to create the feelings of women, the invisibility of women were the question actually. All the feminist writers, all the feminist scholars from the French school, basically they address the question of the invisibility of women in language. The invisibility, how come it happened? How come the expression, the self, the individuality of women were not represented in language? So this was questioned by several critics like, several feminists like Luz Irigaray. And Luz Irigaray, you can see that Luz Irigaray, she famously said, she defined the feminine identity. The feminine identity actually requires how an androcentric reality is imposed upon the process of language acquisition during the early childhood through the mechanism of generic masculine. So she asked, how the reality, how can a woman talk about reality? Because how can she express the reality? Because the language itself is male dominated. So the language, she cannot express her subjectivity in the language itself. And Julia Kristeva, she took another stand. She called Cora. She went back to the Freudian concept, to similar with the pre-libidinal complex, in which you can see everybody can share the experience of woman itself, because once both male and female, they were the part of mother's body, and they can share, or they can enjoy, or they can experience the feeling of a woman. This is what Julia Kristeva said. And this happened in the first half of, the middle part of middle ages of 20th century, and we can see that language was a problematic area in the discourse, the discourse of feminist criticism. And likewise, in the meantime, during the time itself, you can see that lot of ethnographers from different fields of communication and anthropology and different culture, history itself, they brought up with a lot of oral tales in which the woman talked experience through orality, through oral tales. So we have been discussing on the the inappropriateness of written language actually. But in oral tradition, you can see a number of human experiences are recorded. So I just want to take a story of, oral stories collected by A.K. Ramanujan, the Indian English author, poet and scholar. I can take two to three stories written by, collected by A.K. Ramanujan in order to establish it actually. So we are familiar with Oedipal myth. We all know that the story of Oedipus. And I just want to take a story by A.K. Ramanujan. That is, mother marries the son. Mother marries the son. Originally it is a folktale that is, this is, you can see this folktale in the entire Konkan stretch. In Karnataka you can see the story, and Goa you can see the story, and part of Maharashtra also you can see the story. So this is the Oedipal version, the Oedipal story. Everybody knows the Oedipal story. I don't want to tell the Oedipal story again. But here you can see that in mother and son story, you can see that the goddess Satvai was appointed by God to write the future of every child on its forehead. The night of the 5th day after its birth. And the king had a daughter, and he asked goddess Satvai to write her future. And Satvai thought that she is the woman, or she will marry her son. And she will marry her son. This is her fate actually. The king wanted to be away from this incest relationship, and he sent her daughter to a dense forest to live there. Okay, so if you go to forest, she can't see men. She won't have any external touch with the outer world, so she will be alone there. But somehow, when the girl drank water which contained the mouthful spat out by the king, it reached her belly and she became pregnant, and she delivered a son. And when the son was born, she left her son in the forest itself. Later, years went on. Finally, she married a young man. At last she married a young man. And from that young man, she came to know that he kept a bag of clothes with him, a heap of clothes with him. And he showed that I don't know about my mother, my origin, my parents, I don't know who are my parents. My mother I don't know, my father I don't know, but I have this heap of clothes with me. And she knew that, she understood that it was her son, and she can't be away from her faith, or it was already told by goddess Satvai. And here we can see that in Indian oral tradition, the same Oedipal, Oedipal dilemma, how this woman tackled it. Okay, he gave two versions actually. The female dilemma of Oedipus in Indian oral tradition, how she tackled it. And she has a son by his son actually. And she just took that son and she started to sing a lullaby. Oh son, you sleep well. Oh son, my husband's son, you sleep well. Oh son, my son of my son, my grandson, you sleep well. So this is what the dilemma, how she tackled it. And in another version, you can see that she approached the goddess and told, please give me a solution to me. And the goddess said, you go back to your family and live happy. So this is what the solution she got from the goddess, and she came back and she joined with the family. So this is what I just want to tell you, that how the Oedipal complex and how this immense complex that in Western mythology, represented in mythology, and how that is represented in Indian oral tradition by folk tales, and how these folk tales represented the same case of dilemma in orality. So this is what we can see, that in language, in one side of language, we can see that this is the dilemma that every man, every man, and he became blind himself, and how she just tackles the situation by addressing in another way, another form of life, how she how she reaches a practical conclusion for that. So this is what Ramanujan says. And another tale by A.K. Ramanujan is a flowering woman's tale. A flowering woman's tale. Have you seen this? You might have heard of that story. And this is also a story in which woman's body is seen as a metaphor. This is seen as a metaphor, and you can see lot of metaphors can be applied into that flowering tree. Lots of metaphors you can apply into that mothering tree. You can see how she is protected by her family. She is from a very poor family, and she is accused of selling her body. But she said that no, this is not my fault, but I got I can flower. I can just blossom. You can take flowers from me. I have this capacity to transform into a tree, from a girl to a tree. So this is my ability actually, and how the woman got misread, or in the sense how she got misunderstood by the society, and she got lot of humiliations on the side of society. Many of her members of her family, the society, and how she got survived all these complexities. So this is what the story is used as a metaphor in that context in Indian oral tradition. And also you can see that in many other oral traditions, in many other oral stories, you can see the same kind of things in which women are more courageous and women appear to be more practical in oral traditions of several parts of India. I can say that in our tradition, in Kerala tradition, we don't have such oral stories. Nobody is there to record our Kerala, oral tradition, or folk tales from the Kerala, like A.K. Ramanujan did it. So we don't get such a rich literature of orality. But across from the parts of across India, lots of stories which did not how the women tackled the complexities of life through language, through this kind of oral stories. You can see that, you can get the idea that, so how women, they tackled the idea of the complexities of life actually. So Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, according to him, the stories, the oral stories are like daughters because they they transcend the time and space actually. Like daughters, according to several ethnographers, ethnocentric studies, you can see that how the stories come from one culture to other culture through ladies, through women. So women were married to some other places, one culture to other places. They took the stories also. So I can give you an example of a very famous example, that is the story of the language called Arawak. So it is a Caribbean language. It's an area between Haiti and Dominican Republic. And in 16th century, the Carib invaders, they got into the small island, and the men were killed and the women were forced to marry these invaders, the Carib invaders. And in 20th century, this is a small language, very minor language called Arawak, is preserved through women, because the women, the ancestral mother, she carried the language to her other family, her next lineage, and from that lineage to other lineage. And this language, the special language that is carried from one woman to another woman, and it is still there. This language is still there. So women, they preserve culture, they preserve language, and they preserve the oral tradition, and especially in South Asia. According to A.K. Ramanujan, the oral tradition, the oral poems and the oral narrations of our South Indian culture, we can see that this is an Indian oral tradition, or the Indian folklore itself is. These are autotelic because it travels across space and linguistic boundaries without necessarily being accompanied by a corresponding movement of populations. And his words, you can see that to attention to women's states can help widen our understandings of gender, language and culture in South Asia by revealing perspectives and practices submerged in socially elite, masculinist and development discourses. So with this, I just want to conclude my presentation.
Okay.